My uncle's silverware clattered against his plate at Thanksgiving dinner as he loudly declared I was the family's greatest disappointment. As relatives sat in uncomfortable silence, he listed all my failings: my wasted art degree, my struggling studio, my inability to get a real job like my cousins. What he didn't know was that I'd already met with my grandmother before she passed, and the envelope I would receive at tomorrow's will reading would change everything. The look on his face when he realized what was happening? Absolutely priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. If this story of family judgment and unexpected vindication speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's video reveals how another underestimated family member turned the tables. The dining room of my grandmother Eleanor's Victorian home had always been an emotional battleground. The massive mahogany table with its ornately carved legs and the antique china cabinet displaying generations of family heirlooms created an imposing backdrop for our annual Thanksgiving gatherings, events that had gradually evolved from warm celebrations into evaluations of everyone's yearly accomplishments, with my Uncle Raymond presiding as self-appointed judge. I had arrived early that morning, wanting to help with preparations as I always did. Though Grandmother Eleanor had passed away just 3 weeks earlier, the family had decided to maintain the Thanksgiving tradition in her honor. My Aunt Patricia, Raymond's wife, had taken over hosting duties, trying her best to replicate Eleanor's legendary meals while adding unmistakable touches of her own. Heavier on the nutmeg in the pumpkin pie, a bit more brandy in the cranberry sauce. "Olivia, dear, could you arrange the place cards?" Patricia asked as I entered the kitchen, her hands deep in stuffing preparation. "And perhaps check that the good silver is properly polished?" I nodded, inhaling the familiar sense of sage, onion, and the particular blend of spices that signaled holiday gatherings in our family. Though Grandmother Eleanor was gone, her presence lingered in these small details: the handwritten recipe cards with fading ink, the specific way the table must be set, the crystal water goblets that only appeared on special occasions. My cousins arrived in succession, each entrance like a carefully choreographed display of success. First came Miranda with her husband Ethan, both surgeons at Boston Memorial, their twin boys dressed in matching sweater vests, already discussing the science fair projects they were developing at their prestigious private school. Then James, recently made partner at his law firm, his wife Sophie pregnant with their third child, both glowing with the particular confidence of people for whom life has unfolded exactly according to plan. Finally, my younger cousin Zach arrived, the recently appointed CFO of a thriving tech startup, his girlfriend Isabel a successful publicist whose client list included several celebrities who regularly appeared in national magazines. Each arrival was accompanied by warm embraces, exclamations over recent achievements, and the subtle reinforcement of our family's unspoken hierarchy. And then there was me, Olivia Harrington, 32 years old, owner of a struggling art studio in a gentrifying neighborhood, single, childless, and perpetually unable to contribute impressive updates during the ritual sharing of accomplishments that punctuated every family gathering. My BFA from RISD, once a source of family pride, or at least tolerance, had gradually transformed in Uncle Raymond's narratives into evidence of impractical choices and wasted potential. Uncle Raymond arrived last, his entrance timed for maximum impact as always. At 63, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a full head of silver hair and the particular posture of someone accustomed to commanding attention in every room he entered. As the executor of my grandmother's estate, and the eldest son, he had assumed the patriarchal role after my grandfather's death 15 years earlier, a position reinforced by his success as the founder of a regional insurance company. "Olivia," he acknowledged with a curt nod as he entered, his gaze quickly moving past me to greet James with considerably more enthusiasm. "There's my boy. Heard about the Westridge acquisition. Brilliant work. I busied myself with final table preparations, arranging the handcrafted centerpiece I'd created specifically for today. An intricate arrangement of dried botanicals, copper wire elements, and hand-painted ceramic pieces in autumn colors. It had taken nearly a week to complete, my small offering to honor grandmother Eleanor, who had always supported my artistic endeavors, even when others in the family began viewing them with increasing skepticism. "What's this thing?" Raymond asked, gesturing toward my centerpiece as we gathered around the table, his tone suggesting he'd discovered something peculiar and possibly unsanitary in the middle of the holiday spread. "Olivia made it," Patricia interjected quickly. "Isn't it creative?" The way she emphasized creative transformed the word into something slightly apologetic, as if creativity were a condition requiring special accommodation rather than a gift to be celebrated. "Grandmother always liked my seasonal pieces," I said quietly, running my finger along one of the copper spirals. "I wanted to make something special since this is our first holiday without her." Raymond's expression softened momentarily at the mention of his mother, a brief glimpse of genuine emotion quickly masked by his usual authoritative demeanor. "Yes, well, Mother always did have a soft spot for your projects." The meal began, with Patricia's nervous fluttering as she presented each dish, constantly referencing how grandmother would have prepared it differently or better. The conversation followed familiar patterns, updates on children's achievements, professional milestones, recent vacations to impressive destinations. I remained mostly quiet, answering direct questions with brief responses that wouldn't invite further interrogation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "And what about you, Olivia?" Miranda eventually asked during a lull in conversation. "How's the studio doing?" Before I could answer, Raymond interjected. "Yes, how is that little hobby shop of yours? Turning a profit yet?" The emphasis on hobby and profit made his assessment abundantly clear. "It's actually been a good year?" I replied, trying to infuse my voice with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "I've expanded my workshop series and they've been consistently selling out. I've also been commissioned for 2 public installation pieces downtown." "Commissioned?" Raymond raised an eyebrow. "You mean someone's actually paying for your art?" "Yes, Uncle Raymond," I said, maintaining eye contact despite the flush creeping up my neck. "The City Arts Council awarded me a grant for the Riverfront Revitalization Project." "A grant," he repeated, cutting into his turkey with surgical precision. "Government handouts for things nobody would actually pay for on the open market. Your grandmother and I had very different philosophies about your career choice. She believed in encouraging your creative expression. I've always thought you needed a dose of reality." Patricia shot him a warning glance, which he either didn't notice or chose to ignore. "You know, there's still a position in our marketing department," he continued, his tone suggesting exceptional generosity. "Nothing fancy, entry-level, of course, given your lack of relevant experience, but it would provide stability, benefits, a foot in the door of an actual business." "Thank you, but I'm committed to my studio," I replied, the practiced response, ready after years of similar offers. Raymond placed his fork down with deliberate care, a gesture I recognized as prelude to one of his pronouncements. "Commitment without results is just stubbornness, Olivia. You're 32 years old, living in a converted warehouse, making trinkets and teaching bored housewives how to play with clay. No partner, no children, no retirement plan. Just like your father, full of artistic notions but ultimately impractical." The mention of my father, his younger brother who had died in a car accident when I was 12, created a momentary freeze around the table. My father was rarely mentioned at family gatherings, his memory seemingly diluted each year by Uncle Raymond's revisionist history that transformed him from the gentle, creative architect he had been into a cautionary tale of impracticality. Dad was an award-winning architect, I said quietly. His firm designed buildings that still stand throughout the city. And yet he died, leaving your mother with nothing but debt and unfinished projects, Raymond countered. If not for this family's support, who knows where you might have ended up? The family's support he referenced had come exclusively from grandmother Eleanor, who had insisted on paying for my education and had provided the initial loan for my studio space, facts Raymond consistently minimized or reframed as family-wide generosity for which I should show appropriate gratitude, primarily by abandoning my artistic pursuits and accepting his vision of a suitable life. Perhaps we could discuss something more festive, Patricia suggested, her nervous laughter punctuating the tension. Sophie, tell everyone about the nursery theme you've chosen. But Raymond wasn't finished. He reached for his wine glass, a signal I recognized from countless previous gatherings, the prelude to what he considered a moment of important family commentary. I think this needs to be said, particularly with Mother's will reading tomorrow, he announced, his voice assuming the authoritative tone he typically reserved for company board meetings. I've spent years watching this family support Olivia's impractical lifestyle choices, waiting for her to outgrow this artistic phase and contribute meaningfully to society like her cousins. Miranda looked uncomfortable, studying her plate, with sudden intensity. James shifted slightly, his expression suggesting he wanted to intervene but wouldn't challenge his uncle directly. Zach, always the family peacemaker, attempted to redirect. Uncle Ray, maybe this isn't… No, it needs to be said, Raymond interrupted. Tomorrow, Mother's estate will be distributed according to her wishes. While I've respected her decisions as executor, I want to be clear about my position. This family has indulged Olivia's childish pursuits long enough. At some point, continued financial support becomes enablement rather than assistance. The implication was clear. He believed I didn't deserve whatever inheritance grandmother might have left me, and would likely have prevented it if he'd had the authority to do so. I'm not asking for anyone's support, I said, my voice steadier than I expected given the rapid beating of my heart. My studio covers its expenses and provides me with a modest living. I'm building something meaningful, even if it doesn't fit your definition of success. Raymond placed his glass down with a finality that silenced the table. Let me be perfectly clear, Olivia. You are this family's greatest disappointment. You had every advantage, every opportunity, and you've squandered it all on childish fantasies. Your grandmother may have humored you, but make no mistake, the rest of us have grown tired of watching you waste your potential. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the normally chatty twins seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, their young faces solemn as they looked between the adults. Patricia's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. James cleared his throat but said nothing, his discomfort evident but his willingness to challenge his uncle non-existent. What no one at that table knew, what Raymond couldn't have imagined as he delivered his practiced assessment of my failings, was that I had already had my own private goodbye with grandmother Eleanor 3 days before she passed. While the family believed I had simply visited her like everyone else, she had specifically requested a private meeting with her lawyer present. What transpired during that meeting was known only to the 3 of us, and the documentation now waiting to be revealed at tomorrow's reading. I think I'll help clear the plates, I said finally, standing with as much dignity as I could muster. In the kitchen, away from Raymond's scrutinizing gaze, I leaned against the counter and took several deep breaths. Patricia joined me moments later, her expression a mixture of sympathy and embarrassment. He doesn't mean to be harsh, she offered, her standard response whenever Raymond crossed lines that would be unacceptable from anyone else. He just wants what's best for you. What's best for me, or what would make him comfortable? I asked, surprising myself with the directness of the question. Patricia blinked, momentarily startled by this deviation from our usual script of her making excuses and me quietly accepting them. Well, he worries about your future, Olivia, We all do. I appreciate the concern, I replied carefully, stacking dessert plates, but I'm actually quite content with my choices and my future. Patricia studied me with newfound curiosity, perhaps detecting something different in my demeanor. For years, I had absorbed Raymond's criticisms with outward acceptance and internal resentment, never directly challenging his assessments. But something had shifted. Perhaps grandmother's passing, perhaps the conversation we'd shared in her final days, or perhaps simply the accumulated weight of diminishment that had finally become too heavy to bear silently. You seem different, she observed cautiously. Do I? I smiled slightly. Maybe I'm finally becoming who I'm meant to be. The remainder of the evening unfolded with predictable discomfort. Raymond, having delivered his pronouncement about my inadequacies, turned his attention to more satisfying subjects, primarily James's recent professional achievements and Miranda's children's academic excellence. I participated minimally in these discussions, my thoughts already focused on tomorrow's reading and what would follow. As guests began departing, James approached me in the hallway while I was collecting my coat. Unlike Raymond, whose disappointment in me was constant and vocal, James maintained a careful neutrality that sometimes felt more like pity than the indifference he likely intended. "Don't take Uncle Ray's comments too personally," he offered. His voice lowered, though Raymond was already outside helping Patricia load leftovers into their car. "He's just old school about career paths and success metrics." "It's fine," I replied, buttoning my coat. "We all know where we stand." James hesitated, seemingly wanting to say more, but constrained by the complicated family dynamics and his own position as Raymond's favorite. "See you tomorrow at the reading, then." I nodded, watching as he rejoined his pregnant wife, and they walked to their luxury SUV, the perfect image of conventional success. As I made my way to my own car, a reliable but aging Subaru that Raymond had once described as appropriately bohemian, I felt an unexpected sense of calm rather than the usual post-holiday emotional exhaustion. For 15 years, since my father's death had left me dependent on the family's support, primarily grandmother Eleanor's, I had absorbed Raymond's assessments of my choices and character. Each criticism had embedded itself like a splinter, small enough to ignore individually but collectively creating a constant, low-grade pain I had come to accept as normal. But my final conversation with grandmother had changed something fundamental, creating a clarity that allowed me to see these patterns with new perspective. My apartment above my studio in the renovated Franklin Textile Building welcomed me with familiar comfort. High ceilings, exposed brick walls, large windows that during daylight hours flooded the space with natural light perfect for my work. The open-plan living area seamlessly connected to my workspace, pottery wheels positioned near windows, kilns safely installed along the back wall, shelves displaying finished pieces and works in progress. This space, which Raymond had dismissively called playing house in an abandoned factory, represented everything I valued: creativity, authenticity, the integration of life and work, the community of fellow artists and makers who occupied other units in the building. It wasn't glamorous by conventional standards, but it was genuinely mine, created through my own vision and effort. I moved through my evening routine with deliberate mindfulness, changing into comfortable clothes, brewing herbal tea, settling into my reading chair by the windows overlooking the city lights. From a drawer in my desk, I removed a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. Eleanor had given me this journal during our final private meeting, explaining that she had begun keeping it shortly after my father's death, recording observations, reflections, and eventually plans that she wasn't yet ready to share with the family. The journal documented her growing concern about the family dynamics, particularly Raymond's increasing control, and the way family gatherings had transformed from celebrations of connection into assessments of achievement. "I failed to intervene early enough," she had told me during that last conversation. her once commanding voice softened by illness but her mind still remarkably clear. I watched Raymond reshape this family according to his values without sufficient challenge, allowing his definitions of success and worth to overshadow other ways of living meaningfully. That failure ends now. As I leafed through the journal's pages, certain passages stood out with particular resonance given the evening's events. Watched Raymond dismiss Olivia's first gallery showing today. The pride in her eyes dimmed with each critical question. He asked, why can't he see that success takes different forms? His narrow vision of achievement blinds him to the courage it takes to create, to risk rejection, to pursue authenticity rather than approval. And later, family dinner tonight was another exercise in hierarchy reinforcement. Raymond's children, and their achievements positioned as the family standard, Olivia's creative work treated as a temporary diversion rather than a legitimate path. I've contributed to this by remaining silent too often, by failing to challenge this narrative directly. My own fear of conflict has enabled patterns that harm the very family bonds I sought to protect. The most revealing entries were from the past year after her diagnosis. Meeting with Harriet today to revise my estate plans. Raymond expects to manage everything according to traditional family divisions, but the more I observe, the more convinced I become that conventional distribution would simply reinforce the unhealthy dynamics I've allowed to develop. More drastic measures are needed to restore balance and ensure my true wishes are honored. And finally, just 2 months before her passing, spoke with Thomas at the foundation today. Arrangements are complete. Raymond will be shocked, James, and Miranda surprised, but ultimately accepting. Zach, I think, will understand immediately. And Olivia, my hope is that Olivia will finally recognize her own worth when she sees it reflected in my final decisions. This is not about punishment, but restoration, not division, but healing. Though it may take time for the family to recognize the difference. I closed the journal, my fingers tracing the embossed initials on its cover. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would fundamentally alter our family's structure and relationships. Raymond's certainty about his position and authority would be challenged in ways he couldn't anticipate. The hierarchy he had so carefully constructed and maintained would be reconfigured according to values he had long dismissed. The prospect should have filled me with vindictive anticipation, but instead, I felt a strange mixture of resolution and sadness. Resolution that patterns of diminishment would finally be addressed, sadness that it had required my grandmother's death and such dramatic intervention to create possibility for change. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with an incoming text from Zach, always the most perceptive of my cousins. Uncle Ray was way out of line today. Just wanted to say I think what you're doing with your studio is actually pretty amazing. Grandma E thought so too. The simple message brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Perhaps the possibilities for authentic connection within our family weren't as limited as I had come to believe. Perhaps tomorrow's revelations, while initially disruptive, might eventually create space for new patterns to emerge. Morning arrived with steel gray skies and light snow, weather that matched the solemnity of the occasion. I dressed carefully, in a charcoal sweater dress I had designed and knitted myself, paired with my grandmother's pearl earrings, her gift on my 25th birthday. The outfit was both a quiet statement of my creative identity and an homage to Eleanor, whose own sense of style had always balanced elegance with personality. The law offices of Winters, Abernathy & Chen occupied the 15th floor of a downtown office building with views of both the river and the city skyline. The conference room where we gathered featured the expected elements of established legal practice: dark wood furnishings, leather chairs, discreet art, and the particular atmosphere of restrained prosperity that Raymond had always found so reassuring. Family members arrived in predictable order. Raymond and Patricia first, ensuring they had time to exchange preliminary observations with Mr. Winters before others arrived. James and Sophie next, perpetually punctual. Miranda and Ethan shortly thereafter. The twins had been left with a sitter, the reading deemed inappropriate for children. Zach and Isabel arriving just minutes before the scheduled start, cutting it close as always, but never actually late. I had chosen a seat toward the end of the table, not out of deference to Raymond's unspoken hierarchy, but because it offered the best vantage point to observe everyone's reactions. Raymond sat at the opposite end, naturally assuming the position of authority without explicit discussion. Patricia to his right, James to his left, the family tableau arranged according to perceived importance with predictable precision. Mr. Winters, who had been my grandmother's attorney for over 30 years, entered precisely at the appointed time, accompanied by his junior partner, Ms. Chen, and a woman I recognized as Dr. Helena Foster, the executive director of the Eleanor Harrington Foundation for the Arts, an organization my grandmother had established 10 years earlier to support arts education in underserved communities. Raymond frowned slightly at Dr. Foster's presence. "Is it necessary to have outside parties present for a family matter?" he asked, his tone suggesting both confusion and mild disapproval. Dr. Foster's presence was specifically requested by Mrs. Harrington, Mr. Winters replied with professional neutrality. "As you'll soon understand, the foundation plays a significant role in her estate plans." This information clearly surprised Raymond, whose brows furrowed deeper as he recalibrated his expectations. As executor, he had been involved in certain aspects of the estate management, but grandmother had apparently maintained some elements as private until this formal reading. "Before we begin," Mr. Winters continued, "Mrs. Harrington left a letter to be read at the opening of these proceedings. With your permission, I'll read it now." He removed an envelope from the file before him, breaking the wax seal that bore my grandmother's distinctive monogram. The room fell silent as he unfolded the pages and began to read. "My dear family, if you're hearing these words, I have completed my journey in this world and begun whatever adventure awaits beyond. While convention might suggest opening with platitudes about love and family bonds, and make no mistake, those bonds have been precious to me, I choose instead to speak with the directness that age and imminent departure permit. Our family has lost its balance. What began as natural pride and achievement has transformed into a hierarchy of worth measured primarily through conventional success metrics, career advancement, financial accumulation, and status markers. This imbalance has been particularly evident in the treatment of Olivia, whose creative path has been consistently devalued despite representing qualities I hold most dear: authenticity, courage, and the prioritization of meaningful work over mere status. My own failure to challenge these patterns more forcefully during my lifetime requires correction through my final arrangements. What follows is not punitive but restorative, an attempt to reestablish equilibrium and create space for different forms of contribution to be valued appropriately. Raymond, you have achieved remarkable professional success and provided generously for your children's advantages. These accomplishments deserve recognition. However, your increasing tendency to measure everyone against your particular definition of achievement has damaged family connections and diminished important contributions that don't fit your metrics. James, Miranda, your professional accomplishments bring me genuine pride, yet I've observed with concern how thoroughly you've adopted your father's value system, sometimes at the expense of your authentic interests and consistently at the cost of meaningful connection with family members who follow different paths. Zach, you've maintained a commendable balance, achieving conventional success while remaining open to diverse expressions of purpose and value. This capacity for both achievement and acceptance represents the family balance I hope to restore. Olivia, your commitment to creative work despite constant pressure to conform to more conventional paths has demonstrated remarkable courage. Your father would be immensely proud of your resilience, as am I. What others have misinterpreted as stubbornness or impracticality, I recognize as integrity and authentic purpose. The arrangements detailed below reflect my considered assessment of what each of you truly needs, rather than what you might want or expect. My hope is that these provisions will create opportunities for reflection, growth, and the restoration of more balanced family relationships. With enduring love and the clarity that approaching death provides, Eleanor Margaret Harrington. The silence following Mr. Winter's reading was absolute. Raymond's face had progressively reddened during certain passages, while James and Miranda exchanged uncomfortable glances. Zach maintained a thoughtful expression, occasionally nodding slightly as if particular points resonated with his own observations. Patricia studied her hands, folded tightly in her lap. I sat perfectly still, my grandmother's words washing over me like validation I hadn't realized I so desperately needed. After years of having my choices questioned and my path diminished, hearing them described as courageous and integrous, especially in this formal setting, created a peculiar feeling of both vindication and sadness. Vindication that my grandmother had truly seen and valued me. Sadness that she had felt unable to express this support more openly during family gatherings dominated by Raymond's perspectives. Well, Raymond finally broke the silence, his tone suggesting barely contained irritation. Mother always did have a flair for the dramatic. Perhaps we could proceed to the actual provisions now. Mr. Winters adjusted his glasses, seemingly unaffected by Raymond's impatience. As requested by Mrs. Harrington, we'll now proceed with the specific provisions of her will. He opened a leather portfolio and removed several documents, arranging them with methodical precision. First, regarding the family home, the Victorian on Maple Avenue that has been in the Harrington family for 3 generations. Raymond nodded with satisfaction. As the eldest son, he had always assumed the property would pass to him, a presumption he had referenced in numerous conversations about eventually renovating or perhaps selling it for substantial profit given its location in the now fashionable historic district. Mrs. Harrington has established that the property be transferred not to an individual family member, but to the Eleanor Harrington Foundation for the Arts, to be converted into a community, art center, and gallery space featuring rotating exhibitions from emerging local artists. The shock that rippled through the room was palpable. Raymond's expression transformed from confident expectation to stunned disbelief. That's not possible, he stammered, his composure fracturing visibly. Mother and I discussed the house staying in the family. It's our heritage. The documentation is quite clear, Mr. Winters replied, sliding a copy of the relevant pages toward Raymond. Mrs. Harrington updated her will 11 months ago, with full legal capacity verified by 2 independent physicians. The property, transfer to the foundation, includes specific provisions for renovation to accommodate studio spaces, classroom areas, and exhibition galleries while preserving the historical character of the building. Raymond scanned the documents, his hands slightly unsteady. There must be some mistake. I'm the executor. You were named executor of certain portions of the estate, Ms. Chen interjected smoothly. But Mrs. Harrington established a separate trust for specific assets, including the family home, with different governance. As this information registered, I recalled a conversation with grandmother Eleanor 6 months earlier, when she had asked unusually detailed questions about what elements would make an ideal community arts center. At the time, I had thought she was simply showing interest in my work. Now I understood she had been gathering practical information for this very purpose. Regarding financial assets, Mr. Winters continued, seemingly impervious to the tension filling the room. Mrs. Harrington's investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $4.7 million, will be distributed as follows. Everyone straightened slightly. While the house represented heritage and status, the investment portfolio represented substantial financial impact, particularly for Raymond, who had made reference to his anticipated inheritance when discussing his early retirement plans. 20% to James Harrington, 20% to Miranda Harrington Wells, 20% to Zachary Harrington. The three cousins exchanged glances, likely calculating their respective shares, approximately $940,000 each, significant, but considerably less than Raymond would have assumed they would receive under traditional family distribution patterns. "And the remaining 40%?" Raymond prompted when Mr. Winters paused. "The remaining 40% will establish an endowed scholarship fund, administered by the foundation, providing educational and mentorship support for young artists, demonstrating exceptional promise but lacking financial resources. This scholarship fund will be named the Thomas and Olivia Harrington Arts Initiative, honoring both Mrs. Harrington's son and her granddaughter. My father's name linked with mine in this way, a public acknowledgement of our shared artistic lineage, sent an unexpected wave of emotion through me. Grandmother had found a way to restore my father's legacy while simultaneously validating my path. Raymond's face had progressed from red to an alarming purplish hue. "This is outrageous. Olivia receives nothing directly, but gets a scholarship, named after her, while my children receive less than half the estate between them?" "Actually," Mr. Winters continued implacably, "there are additional provisions regarding Olivia's inheritance." He nodded to Ms. Chen, who opened a separate folder and extracted another document. Mrs. Harrington established a separate trust specifically for Olivia Harrington, containing 3 elements. First, ownership of the collection of 20th century American art acquired by Mrs. Harrington over the past 40 years, professionally appraised at $2.8 million. A small gasp escaped Patricia. Grandmother's art collection, the carefully curated paintings, sculptures, and mixed media pieces that had adorned her home, had been a source of family pride, though Raymond had often complained about the impractical expense of maintaining and insuring it. Second, a cash provision of $1 million to be used at Ms. Harrington's discretion for expansion of her artistic enterprise or other professional development. Raymond's hands flattened against the conference table as if he needed physical support. "Mother left Olivia nearly $4 million in assets. This is..." "And third," Ms. Chen continued without acknowledging the interruption, "the intellectual property rights to Thomas Harrington's architectural designs, including royalties from his published works and licensing fees from his most significant buildings." This final provision struck me with particular force. My father's architectural legacy, the innovative designs that had won awards and influenced sustainable building practices, had been managed by Raymond after his death, with proceeds ostensibly held in trust, but never fully accounted for to my mother or me. Grandmother's arrangement would not only restore control of this legacy, but also potentially provide ongoing income independent of the other provisions. "This is absurd," Raymond declared, pushing back from the table. "Mother was clearly not in her right mind when she made these arrangements. I'll contest this immediately." "You are certainly entitled to pursue legal challenges," Mr. Winters replied, his tone suggesting he had anticipated this reaction. However, Mrs. Harrington took extensive precautions to ensure her competency was well documented. Additionally, she recorded a video statement explaining her reasoning for each provision, which would be presented in court should any challenges arise. He turned to Dr. Foster, who had remained quietly observant throughout the proceedings. "Dr. Foster, as executive director of the foundation, perhaps you could explain the transition timeline for the property?" Before she could respond, Raymond interrupted. "I want to see this video, now." Mr. Winters consulted his watch. "That wasn't planned for today's proceedings, but we can certainly accommodate the request if all parties agree." Everyone nodded, curiosity overriding any desire to conclude the increasingly tense meeting. A screen descended from the ceiling at the end of the conference room, and Ms. Chen connected her laptop. After a moment, my grandmother's face appeared, recorded perhaps 2 months before her passing. Though visibly affected by illness, Her eyes remained sharp, her posture dignified despite being filmed from what appeared to be her hospital bed. If you're viewing this recording, it means someone, most likely Raymond, has questioned my mental capacity or intentions regarding my estate distribution. She smiled slightly, the familiar, determined expression I had always admired. Always. Predictable Raymond. She adjusted her position slightly, wincing with the effort before continuing. Let me state clearly for the legal record. I am of sound mind and under no undue influence. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison and Dr. Samuel Abrams have conducted thorough cognitive assessments within the past week, confirming my decisional capacity. Their reports are included in the legal documentation. She paused, taking a careful sip of water before continuing. Now, to address the substance of my decisions. The conversion of the family home into a community arts center honors our family's historical commitment to civic engagement, a tradition Raymond has largely abandoned in favor of personal accumulation. The balanced distribution to my grandchildren acknowledges their accomplishments while preventing excessive concentration of resources that might reinforce unhealthy family dynamics. Her gaze seemed to intensify, as if she could anticipate exactly where in the room Raymond would be sitting. The provision for Olivia specifically addresses a long-standing inequity. Since Thomas's death, Raymond has systematically undermined Olivia's confidence, devalued her chosen path, and managed Thomas's estate in ways that diverted resources and recognition that rightfully belonged to his daughter. This correction is not preferential treatment but restorative justice. She leaned closer to the camera, her voice strengthening with conviction. Raymond, I know you believe you've always acted in the family's best interest. Your definition of best interest, however, has increasingly centered on status, conventional achievement, and control, values that have distorted our family's interactions and diminished its collective joy. My hope is that these arrangements will create space for reflection and, eventually, more balanced relationships. She sat back, her expression softening slightly. To my grandchildren, James, Miranda, Zach, and especially Olivia, I leave you not just material resources but this final lesson. Define success by authenticity, integrity, and the courage to pursue your genuine purpose, even when that path isn't validated by others. True legacy isn't measured in accounts or accolades, but in lives touched and meaningful work accomplished. The screen went dark, leaving a profound silence in the conference room. I sat completely still, overwhelmed by emotions too complex to immediately process. Grandmother's forthright acknowledgement of the patterns I had experienced for years, the systematic undermining, the devaluation of my choices, the diversion of my father's legacy, validated perceptions I had often questioned, wondering if I was being overly sensitive or paranoid. Raymond stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. This is character assassination. Mother was clearly influenced by someone. His gaze shifted accusingly toward me. What did you say to her during those private visits? What manipulation did you employ when she was vulnerable? Before I could respond, Zach intervened, his voice calm but firm. Uncle Ray, Grandma Eleanor was sharp until the very end. We all know that. And everything she said matches what I've observed at family gatherings for years. You too? Raymond turned toward him, betrayal evident in his expression. After everything this family has done for all of you? This family, Zach emphasized carefully, includes Grandma Eleanor, who apparently saw things more clearly than the rest of us were willing to acknowledge. Miranda and James remained silent, their expressions suggesting internal conflict. Perhaps recognition of patterns they had participated in without full awareness. Perhaps concern about positioning themselves against Raymond. Perhaps genuine surprise at their grandmother's unfiltered assessment. Dr. Foster cleared her throat gently. If I might add some context that might be helpful, Mrs. Harrington approached the foundation about the potential property conversion nearly 2 years ago. Our discussions were extensive and thoughtful, exploring multiple options before she determined this was the most appropriate use of the family home. This wasn't a hasty decision made under duress. Raymond seemed unmoved by this information, turning instead to Mr. Winters. "I'll be consulting separate legal counsel. Expect formal challenges to these provisions." He gathered his papers with sharp, agitated movements, nodding curtly to Patricia, who rose immediately to follow him toward the door. Before exiting, he turned back, his gaze landing directly on me. "This isn't over, Olivia. Mother may have been manipulated into this. Redistribution, but I won't allow Thomas's legacy and our family home to be squandered on your artistic fantasies." As the door closed behind them, an uncomfortable silence settled over the remaining family members. James was the first to speak, his legal training evident in his measured tone. "That was unexpected," he offered, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. "I'm not sure what to think about all this." "I think Grandma was pretty clear about what she thought," Zach replied, a hint of challenge in his typically easygoing demeanor. "And I have to say, I've noticed the same patterns she described." Miranda looked between her brothers, conflict evident in her expression. "We should probably discuss this as siblings before saying anything further," she suggested, her instinct for damage control activating. "This is a lot to process." I remained silent, still absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The validation of my grandmother's provisions was overwhelming enough, but the public acknowledgement of patterns I had experienced in isolation for years created a peculiar sensation, relief tinged with sadness that such dramatic intervention had been necessary. As the meeting concluded with technical details about asset transfers and documentation requirements, I gathered my things with deliberate calm, though internally I felt anything but composed. James, Miranda, and Zach huddled near the doorway, their conversation hushed but intense, likely negotiating their collective response to the situation. Dr. Foster approached as I prepared to leave. "Olivia, when you're ready, I'd love to discuss your involvement with the Arts Center conversion. Eleanor was quite insistent that you play a significant role in conceptualizing the space, particularly the educational components. The invitation, recognition, of my professional capacity rather than mere familial obligation, felt simultaneously validating and overwhelming given the morning's revelations. "I'd like that," I managed, my voice steadier than I expected. "Maybe next week, after things have settled a bit?" She nodded understanding. "Of course. This is a lot to process. Eleanor spoke of you often, you know. She was immensely proud of the path you've chosen and the integrity with which you've pursued it, despite significant family pressure." These words, this confirmation that my grandmother's support hadn't been merely sentimental indulgence, as Raymond had often suggested, but genuine recognition of value, released something I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Tears threatened, and I took a deep breath to maintain composure. "Thank you for telling me that," I said simply. As I left the building, the winter air sharp against my face, I noticed Zach jogging to catch up with me. "Hey," he said, falling into step beside me. "That was intense. You okay?" His genuine concern, free from the calculation that often characterized family interactions, created space for honesty. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "It's a lot to take in." "Uncle Ray was completely out of line yesterday," he said as we walked. "And apparently for a lot longer than any of us acknowledged." We reached my car, pausing in the light snowfall that had begun during the meeting. I studied my cousin's face, wondering what prompted his direct acknowledgement now when he, like others, had remained mostly silent during years of similar dynamics. "Why did no one ever say anything?" I asked, the question emerging from some deep place of accumulated hurt. "All those Thanksgivings, All those family gatherings where he systematically diminished everything about my life and choices. Why did everyone just let it happen? Zach leaned against my car, considering the question with unexpected seriousness. Honestly, I think we all benefited from the hierarchy he created. As long as Uncle Ray was focusing his criticism on you, he wasn't scrutinizing the rest of us as closely. It was easier to let you be the family disappointment than to risk becoming one ourselves. He grimaced, genuine regret in his expression. It was cowardly. I'm sorry, Liv. The simple apology, perhaps the first genuine accountability from any family member, felt like the breaking of a dam. Tears I had suppressed throughout the reading finally emerged, not in dramatic sobs, but quiet streams that traced cold paths down my cheeks. Zach, never one for conventional displays of emotion, simply stood steady beside me, offering silent presence rather than platitudes or awkward reassurances. Grandma saw it all, didn't she? I finally said, wiping my face with my gloved hand. All these years while we thought she was just the sweet, slightly distracted family matriarch. Apparently she was taking detailed notes and making strategic plans, Zach finished with a hint of admiration. Honestly, it's kind of badass. The description startled a laugh from me. Badass, never being a term I'd associated with my elegant, proper grandmother. Yet it fit perfectly with the woman revealed in today's proceedings. Clear-eyed, strategic, and unwilling to allow established patterns to continue unchallenged once she recognized their harm. What happens now? I asked, not really expecting Zach to have answers, but needing to voice the question consuming my thoughts. Uncle Ray will almost certainly pursue legal challenges, he replied, practical as always. James is probably already calculating how to position himself without directly opposing Uncle Ray while still protecting his inheritance. Miranda will follow James's lead while trying to maintain family peace. He shrugged. The usual family dynamics, just with higher stakes. And you? I asked, genuinely curious about his position in the unfolding situation. I think Grandma got it exactly right, he said simply. And I'll support her wishes however I can, including testifying about family patterns if it comes to that. His straightforward support, perhaps the first unambiguous alliance I'd experienced within the family since my father's death, was unexpectedly stabilizing amidst the day's turbulence. Thank you, I said, meaning it deeply. As I drove home, through gently falling snow, the implications of the morning's revelations gradually crystallized. Beyond the material provisions, significant though they were, Grandmother Eleanor had given me something far more valuable. External validation of perceptions I had begun to doubt after years of systematic dismissal. The patterns I had experienced weren't imagined or exaggerated. They were real enough that an astute observer had documented them extensively and taken extraordinary measures to address them. My apartment above the studio welcomed me with familiar comfort, the space I had created despite Raymond's consistent dismissal of it as playing house in a commercial building. The late afternoon light filtered through the large industrial windows, illuminating my work in progress. A series of sculptural pieces exploring themes of voice and silence, containment, and expansion. Pieces that, I realized with sudden clarity, had been unconsciously processing the very family dynamics Grandmother Eleanor had named so explicitly in her final communications. I moved through the space with newfound awareness, seeing it not as the compromise Raymond had characterized it to be, but as physical manifestation of authentic choice, prioritizing creative function over conventional luxury, integrated living, and working over artificial separation of personal and professional identities, meaningful aesthetics over status signifiers. The studio phone rang, interrupting my reflections. The caller ID showed Harrington Insurance, Raymond's company. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, not yet ready for whatever conversation might follow the morning's revelations. Something, perhaps curiosity, Perhaps the new resolve emerging from grandmother's validation prompted me to answer. Olivia speaking. I'm calling to inform you that I've instructed my attorneys to file formal challenges to Mother's will. Provisions. Raymond's voice carried the particular clipped quality it assumed when he was containing intense emotion. I'm also investigating potential undue influence charges. Your private meetings with Mother shortly before her death appear highly suspicious given the nature of her provisions. The accusation that I had somehow manipulated my dying grandmother for financial gain might once have devastated me, triggering immediate defensive justification. Instead, I felt an unexpected calm, recognizing the accusation as continuation of established patterns rather than legitimate claim requiring response. That's your right, of course, I replied evenly. Though I imagine grandmother anticipated this reaction and prepared accordingly. This isn't over, he stated, the familiar phrase now carrying different weight than when he'd used it at the conclusion of the will reading. I built this family's legacy through decades of strategic work. I won't allow it to be redirected based on Mother's sentimental attachment to artistic indulgences. The phrasing crystallized something I had sensed but never fully articulated. Raymond genuinely believed he had created the family's status and resources, consistently minimizing both my grandfather's foundational work that had established the insurance company and my grandmother's substantial inheritance that had provided capital for its expansion. This revision of history allowed him to position himself as primary benefactor rather than beneficiary of family resources. The family legacy predates both of us, Uncle Raymond, I said quietly. Grandmother's decisions reflect her values and priorities, just as your management of family matters has reflected yours. Perhaps the difference is that she recognized diverse forms of contribution rather than measuring everyone against a single standard. His sharp intake of breath suggested the observation had struck a nerve. You have no idea what building a real legacy entails. Playing with clay and paint doesn't qualify you to lecture me about contribution or standards. I'm not lecturing, I replied, maintaining steady calm despite the familiar dismissal. Just acknowledging that grandmother saw things differently than you do and made provisions accordingly. After he disconnected abruptly, I sat with the unexpected steadiness I had maintained throughout the conversation. In previous interactions, Raymond's dismissals had triggered immediate self-doubt, his authoritative certainty overwhelming my tentative confidence. Today, anchored by grandmother's explicit acknowledgement of these patterns, I had remained connected to my own perspective, rather than automatically deferring to his. This small shift, the capacity to maintain internal coherence despite external pressure, felt more significant than the material provisions of the will. Grandmother's validation had created space for me to trust my own perceptions, even when confronted with familiar patterns of diminishment. As evening settled over the city, I found myself drawn to the work table in my studio space. The clay called to me, not as escape from the day's emotional complexities, but as medium through which to process them. My hands moved with instinctive understanding, shaping a vessel form that gradually emerged with distinctive asymmetry, strong in structure but intentionally unbalanced in conventional terms, finding stability through counterweights rather than perfect symmetry. Working late into the night, I found myself reflecting on what might emerge from the day's revelations. Raymond would certainly pursue legal challenges, potentially creating months of conflict and complication. James and Miranda might align with their father out of habitual deference or genuine belief in his position. Family gatherings would likely be tense, awkward affairs in the immediate future. Yet beneath these predictable patterns, something new had been introduced. Explicit acknowledgement of dynamics previously maintained through collective silence. Grandmother's interventions had created possibility for different conversations, different relationships, different understandings of success and contribution within our family system. As I finally prepared for bed in the early morning hours, physically tired but mentally clarified by the day's events and the subsequent hours of creative work, my phone chimed with an incoming text. The sender surprised me. James, who rarely communicated with me directly outside of family gatherings. "Can we meet tomorrow? Just you and me. There are things I need to understand better." The request itself represented deviation from established patterns. James, as Raymond's presumptive successor in the family hierarchy, typically maintained careful distance from anything that might suggest questioning of Raymond's perspectives or decisions. "Of course," I replied after brief consideration. "My studio at 2 p.m.? His response came quickly. "I'll be there." As I finally drifted toward sleep, I found myself considering how my grandmother, apparently so accepting of family patterns during her lifetime, had ultimately chosen to disrupt them so thoroughly through her final arrangements. What had catalyzed this decision? Had she harbored these perceptions throughout the years of Raymond's increasing control, waiting for the right moment to intervene? Or had approaching death provided clarity about dynamics she had previously accepted, without full awareness of their impact? Regardless of when her understanding had crystallized, her chosen response reflected remarkable courage. Willingness to create temporary disruption in service of potential healing, to risk immediate conflict for the possibility of eventual balance. This courage, I realized, represented a form of love far more demanding than mere indulgence or acceptance. Love that prioritized genuine well-being over comfortable illusions, authentic connection over artificial harmony. The realization accompanied me into dreams, transforming my understanding of my grandmother from kindly supporter to clear-eyed catalyst for necessary change. A transformation that would continue unfolding in the days and weeks ahead as her final lessons reverberated through our family system. James arrived at my studio precisely at 2 o'clock the following day. His punctuality wasn't surprising. He approached all commitments with the same methodical precision that had propelled him through law school and into partnership at his firm. What was unexpected, however, was his appearance. Gone was the carefully pressed suit and polished presentation that had become his uniform since joining Raymond's preferred firm. Instead, he wore jeans and a casual sweater that momentarily transported me back to our teenage years, before professional identity had overshadowed personal connection. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, standing awkwardly just inside the studio entrance, his gaze traveling over the space with genuine curiosity, rather than the polite disinterest he typically displayed toward my work. "I've never actually been here before, have I?" "No," I confirmed, gesturing toward the sitting area I'd arranged near the front windows, comfortable chairs surrounding a low table I'd crafted from reclaimed wood. "Coffee?" He nodded, still surveying the space as I prepared 2 cups from the small kitchenette that served both my workspace and the occasional workshops I hosted. "This is not what I expected," he admitted as I handed him his coffee and settled into the chair opposite. "It's much more professional than the way Uncle Ray always described it." The observation, though seemingly minor, highlighted how thoroughly Raymond's narratives had shaped family perceptions, creating versions of reality that others accepted without direct verification. "What did you expect?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than defensive. James considered the question, his expression suggesting internal reassessment. "I guess I pictured something more haphazard, like an art student's first apartment combined with a hobby space." He gestured toward the clearly defined work zones, the organized materials, the gallery-quality lighting. "This is a legitimate business operation." "It is," I agreed simply. "It has been for several years." He nodded slowly, absorbing this disconnect between narrative and reality. "I should have visited sooner, seen for myself." The acknowledgement that he had accepted Raymond's characterizations without verification created opening for the conversation I sensed he had come to have. "Yesterday was illuminating," he finally said, setting his coffee down and leaning forward slightly. Grandma's assessment of the family dynamics made me uncomfortable, particularly her observations about me. I remained silent, allowing him space to continue without immediate reassurance or contradiction. This itself represented significant shift in our interaction pattern. Previously, I would have quickly minimized any discomfort, accepting responsibility for tension even when I hadn't created it. The thing is, he continued after a moment, I can't dismiss what she said. Not entirely. When she described how thoroughly I'd adopted Dad's value system, sometimes at the expense of authentic interests. He paused, struggling visibly. It hit home in ways I wasn't prepared for. In what ways? I asked, offering engagement without assuming I understood his experience. I never wanted to practice corporate law, he admitted, the confession emerging with visible difficulty. Throughout law school, I was drawn to environmental law, specifically legal frameworks for sustainable development. I had offers from firms specializing in that sector. This revelation surprised me. James had always presented his career trajectory as natural extension of his talents and interests, his position at Raymond's preferred firm as logical culmination of his educational preparation. What happened? Dad made it clear that joining Morrison Whitfield was the appropriate choice for someone with my education and family background. Environmental law was characterized as activism masquerading as legal practice, not suitable for a Harrington. James's tone conveyed the particular mixture of resignation and resentment I recognized from my own experience of Raymond's influential disapproval. After enough conversations, I convinced myself he was right, that I'd been temporarily seduced by idealistic notions rather than practical professional considerations. The parallel to my own experience was striking, the systematic delegitimization of personal inclinations that didn't align with Raymond's vision, the gradual internalization of his assessments until they became seemingly self-generated. And now? I asked. Now I'm a sixth-year associate specializing in corporate acquisitions, working 60-hour weeks on matters I find intellectually challenging but personally meaningless, married to someone Dad approved of from the right, family background, living in a neighborhood he deemed appropriate, and wondering why accomplishing everything on his checklist hasn't produced the fulfillment he promised would follow. The raw honesty of this assessment, so different from James's typical careful presentation, created unexpected connection between us. For perhaps the first time since childhood, we were engaging not as performers in Raymond's family hierarchy, but as equals navigating the complex impact of shared dynamics. What about Miranda and Zach? I asked, curious about his perception of our cousin's experiences. Miranda adapted most successfully to Dad's expectations, James replied thoughtfully. I think her natural inclinations happened to align more closely with his values, so the adjustments required were less severe. She genuinely enjoys the status and recognition her surgical career provides, though I sometimes wonder if her choice of specialty was influenced more by its prestige ranking than personal interest. He sipped his coffee before continuing. Zach's always been the most independent, geographically and psychologically. Moving to Seattle after college created natural distance from daily family influence. His tech career satisfied Dad's success, metrics while allowing him to maintain his own value system beneath the surface approval. As James spoke, I recognized how thoroughly Raymond's influence had shaped all our lives, not just through direct control, but through the family culture. He had gradually established where certain choices were celebrated while others were subtly or explicitly discouraged. The understanding crystallized something I had intuited but never fully articulated. Raymond's power derived not primarily from financial control, but from his ability to define reality for the family system, establishing what constituted success, practical choices, and appropriate priorities. Grandma saw it all, didn't she? James said, echoing my own realization from the previous day. All these years we thought she was just going along with Dad's perspective, but she was actually observing and evaluating the impact. I think she was conflicted, I offered. She valued family harmony and probably hoped the dynamics would naturally correct without her direct intervention. When that didn't happen, and especially after her diagnosis when time became limited, She chose to address them more directly. James nodded slowly. Through her estate provisions rather than confrontation during her lifetime. She was never comfortable with direct conflict, I acknowledged. But that doesn't mean she wasn't paying attention or forming independent assessments. We sat in contemplative silence for several moments, each processing these realizations through our distinct experiences of the family system. Finally, James spoke again, his voice quieter but more determined. I didn't just come here to process yesterday's revelations, Olivia. I came because I owe you an apology. The statement caught me off guard. Throughout our adult relationship, James had never been unkind to me, but neither had he actively challenged Raymond's treatment or narratives about my choices. For what specifically? I asked, not from defensiveness, but genuine curiosity about which aspects of our history he was recognizing. For my complicity, he said simply. For all the times I sat silently while Dad diminished your choices or questioned your character. For accepting his characterizations of your work without seeing it for myself. For prioritizing my position in his approval hierarchy over honest relationship with you. The directness of this acknowledgement, free from qualifications or explanations, created space for authentic response rather than polite dismissal. Thank you, I said, matching his sincerity. That means a lot, especially now. Dad's already meeting with lawyers about challenging the will, he continued, shifting to practical matters. He's building a case around undue influence, suggesting you manipulated Grandma during her illness to secure preferential treatment. The information didn't surprise me. Raymond had made his intentions clear, but hearing the specific approach confirmed the challenges ahead. What's your position on that? I asked directly, needing clarity about where James stood in the developing conflict. He met my gaze steadily. I won't support it. Neither will Sophie. We both believe Grandma knew exactly what she was doing, and her choices, while unexpected, reflected her genuine assessment of the situation. This clear statement of position, particularly from someone who had rarely opposed Raymond directly, represented significant shift in family dynamics. Have you told him that? Not yet, James admitted. But I will. Sophie and I have been talking since yesterday's reading. A lot of realizations emerging about patterns we've accepted without question. He glanced around the studio again, his attention settling on a series of ceramic pieces displayed on the far wall, vessel forms created using an experimental technique I'd been developing. Could you show me your work? He asked unexpectedly. Really show me. I mean, help me understand what you actually do here. The request, simple but profound in its departure from our established interaction patterns, opened possibility for connection that transcended the family narratives that had previously defined our relationship. For the next hour, I guided James through my creative process, explaining my conceptual frameworks, technical approaches, and the business model that sustained my practice. He listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions that revealed intelligence engaged with unfamiliar territory rather than dismissive skepticism. You've built something legitimate here, he observed as the tour concluded. Something with integrity and purpose. I understand now why Grandma saw your path so differently than Dad does. This validation, from someone who had previously accepted Raymond's dismissive characterizations without question, created unexpected affirmation that complemented Grandmother's more dramatic intervention. What will you do now? I asked, as he prepared to leave. About your own situation, I mean. He considered the question with unusual openness. I'm not entirely sure yet, but Sophie and I have started having conversations we should have had years ago about what success actually means to us, about whether the path we've been following reflects our authentic values or just Dad's expectations. He smiled slightly. Your example might prove more influential than you realize. After James left, I remained in the studio, processing the unexpected connection that had emerged from Grandmother's intervention. Our conversation had transcended the estate provisions to address the underlying patterns that had shaped all our lives, patterns now visible in ways they hadn't been before her explicit naming of them. The remainder of the week brought similar conversations with other family members. Miranda called, her initial awkwardness gradually giving way to genuine curiosity about my perspective on family dynamics. Though less immediately introspective than James about her own choices, she acknowledged the imbalance in how my path had been treated compared to her own. "I never really questioned it," she admitted. "Your choices were positioned as problematic for so long that it became background assumption rather than active judgment. I'm sorry for not seeing that more clearly." Zach and Isabel invited me to dinner, creating space for more extended conversation about grandmother's observations and their implications for future family interactions. "Uncle Ray is organizing a formal family meeting," Zach informed me over dessert, positioning it as opportunity to resolve differences about Grandma's estate, but pretty clearly intending to present united front against the provisions. "Will you go?" Isabel asked, her outsider perspective providing useful clarity about family patterns she had observed since beginning relationship with Zach. "I think I have to," I replied after consideration. Not because I expect Raymond to genuinely engage with grandmother's concerns, but because refusing would reinforce his narrative about me separating myself from family obligations when they don't serve my interests. Zach nodded understanding. "Strategic engagement rather than either confrontation or avoidance. Grandma would approve." "I've been thinking about Dad's accusation that our support for grandmother's provisions is motivated by financial self-interest rather than genuine agreement with her assessment." I nodded, acknowledging the challenging implication. "The thing is," he continued, "there's uncomfortable element of truth in it, at least for me. Not that I'm supporting the provisions because of my inheritance, but that I remained silent about family patterns I recognized as harmful because challenging them might have threatened my position in Dad's approval hierarchy, which carried both emotional and potential financial implications. This honest self-assessment, acknowledging complex motivations rather than presenting idealized version, represented significant departure from James's typical carefully managed self-presentation. "I think that's true for all of us in different ways," I acknowledged. "We all adapted to the family system as it evolved, finding ways to protect ourselves within its constraints. Grandmother included. Her journal reveals her own conflicts about when and how to address patterns she recognized as harmful. This recognition that everyone, including grandmother and myself, had participated in maintaining the family dynamics through various forms of accommodation or strategic silence provided more nuanced understanding than simple villain-victim narratives might suggest. "The question isn't whether we've been complicit," James observed with unexpected insight, "but whether we're willing to make different choices now that the patterns are explicitly named." This framing, focusing on future possibilities rather than past limitations, offered pathway for genuine change without requiring perfect awareness or behavior from any individual. It acknowledged human complexity while maintaining space for growth and transformation. As I drove home through early evening darkness, I found myself contemplating the remarkable shifts occurring within our family system. Not just the material redistribution outlined in grandmother's will, but the more profound disruption of established patterns and perspectives that had constrained authentic connection for decades. The road ahead would certainly include challenges. Raymond's threatened legal action would create practical complications and emotional strain. Established patterns wouldn't transform overnight, and some family members might ultimately retreat to familiar positions rather than sustaining the vulnerability required for genuine change. Yet, something fundamental had already shifted through grandmother's courageous intervention and our collective response to it. Perspectives previously suppressed had found voice. Patterns previously accepted as given were now subject to examination. Possibilities previously unimagined now existed within our shared awareness. Arriving home, I felt simultaneous exhaustion, and invigoration, the particular combination that often accompanied significant creative breakthroughs in my artistic practice. Moving through my evening routine, I found myself drawn once again to my work table, hands reaching for clay with instinctive recognition that physical creation offered integration pathway for the day's emotional and intellectual processing. As I worked, shaping material that responded to pressure and intention with both compliance and resistance, I recognized parallel process occurring within our family system. Long-established patterns both yielding to and resisting the pressure for transformation, new forms emerging that honored essential substance while reconfiguring relationship structures. The piece taking shape beneath my hands gradually revealed itself as vessel form with distinctive spiral opening, container that simultaneously protected and revealed its contents, structure that provided stability while maintaining openness to continued evolution and exchange. As physical metaphor for the family transformation process grandmother had initiated, it captured both the protection of established connections and the necessity of openness to new possibilities. Working late into the night, I found myself experiencing renewed appreciation for grandmother's particular courage, her willingness to use her final arrangements not simply for material distribution, but for naming truths that created possibility, for healing long-established patterns. Her approach reflected profound understanding that genuine love sometimes requires disruption of comfortable illusions when those illusions prevent authentic connection and growth. This insight, that meaningful change often requires courageous disruption rather than comfortable accommodation, would guide my approach to the challenges that certainly lay ahead as Raymond pursued his threatened legal challenges and the family navigated its reconfigured relational landscape. The vessel taking shape beneath my hands, with its spiral opening and balanced asymmetry, would serve as tangible reminder of this understanding in the days and weeks ahead. Not perfect resolution, but ongoing process, not finished product, but continuing evolution toward more authentic expression and connection. Spring arrived with symbolic timing 6 months after grandmother Eleanor's will reading. The community gardens outside the Franklin Textile Building bloomed with unexpected vigor, mirroring the transformations unfolding in my life and family relationships. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my studio, watching fellow artists and neighbors tending their garden plots, the collaborative activity reflecting the new sense of community that had gradually emerged in both my professional and personal worlds. The legal challenges Raymond had initiated the day after our family meeting had proceeded exactly as James predicted: extensive, expensive, and ultimately unsuccessful. Grandmother's meticulous documentation of her mental capacity, the video explanation of her intentions, and the consistent timeline of estate modifications had created an unassailable foundation that even Harrison Blackwell's aggressive strategies couldn't overcome. The court's final ruling had come 3 weeks earlier, definitively upholding all provisions of grandmother's will and trust arrangements. The family home would indeed become the Eleanor Harrington Center for Community Arts. My inheritance would proceed as specified, and the Thomas and Olivia Harrington Arts Initiative would begin accepting scholarship applications for the upcoming academic year. What the legal proceedings couldn't resolve, were the deeper family dynamics grandmother had identified. Those continued evolving through individual choices and interactions that legal documents couldn't dictate or control. The studio doorbell chimed, interrupting my reflections. Dr. Helena Foster entered, carrying architectural renderings for the Arts Center conversion. Our working relationship had developed into genuine collaboration over the months since the will reading, her administrative expertise complementing my artistic perspective as we developed programming concepts for the center. The structural engineer's assessment came back better than expected, she announced, spreading the plans across my work table. The main floor can accommodate the community studio spaces without significant modification, and the conservatory has perfect natural light for the exhibition gallery. I studied the renderings with both professional interest and personal emotion. Seeing my childhood home reimagined as creative community space generated complex feelings, nostalgic connection to family history alongside excitement about the new possibilities emerging from grandmother's vision. The memorial installation for your father will occupy this alcove. Helena indicated a space I remembered as my father's favorite reading nook. We've commissioned Jamal Rodriguez to create a piece incorporating elements of your father's architectural drawings, connecting his design work to the building's new purpose. The thoughtful integration of my father's legacy into the center's design reflected grandmother's intention that the project serve as restoration rather than merely redistribution, acknowledging contributions that had been minimized in family narratives while creating infrastructure for future creative development. Have you had any further communication with your uncle? Helena asked, her question reflecting genuine concern rather than mere curiosity. Having witnessed Raymond's behavior during the legal proceedings, she understood the personal challenges underlying the professional collaboration. Nothing direct, I replied, arranging color swatches alongside the architectural renderings. He declined the invitation to join the center's advisory board, as expected. Patricia called last week to ask if she might volunteer with the children's programming once the center opens, though she was careful to mention that Raymond doesn't know she reached out. This small act of independence from Patricia, tentative but significant given her decades of careful alignment with Raymond's positions, represented one of many subtle shifts occurring within the family system following grandmother's intervention. And your cousins? James has accepted a position with an environmental law firm in Vermont, I shared, still slightly amazed by this development. He gave notice at Morrison Whitfield last month. Sophie's thrilled. Apparently, she's been hoping for this change for years but didn't want to pressure him. The decision, returning to the environmental law path James had originally envisioned before Raymond's influence redirected him, represented perhaps the most dramatic practical response to grandmother's challenge to examine whether our choices reflected authentic values or external expectations. Miranda remains more cautious, understandably concerned about maintaining relationships with both her father and the rest of the family. But she's begun bringing her children to my weekend workshops, creating space for connection outside Raymond's direct influence. These evolving relationships with James, Sophie, Miranda, and their children had been unexpected gifts emerging from grandmother's intervention, connections based on authentic exchange rather than performance within established hierarchy. And your professional developments? Helena prompted, gesturing toward the exhibition announcement posted near my workspace, my upcoming solo show at Meridian Gallery, one of the city's most respected contemporary art venues. The question invited reflection on the remarkable transformations in my creative practice since grandmother's provisions had created both material resources and psychological space for expanded vision. The financial security provided by my inheritance had allowed me to decline commercial commissions that didn't align with my artistic direction, while the validation of grandmother's explicit recognition had dismantled internal barriers constructed through years of systematic diminishment. The new sculptural series is nearly complete, I replied, leading Helena toward the partitioned area where my most significant work in progress resided. The gallery director visited last week and suggested extending the exhibition to include the community engagement documentation. The work represented significant evolution in both concept and execution. Large-scale ceramic installations incorporating architectural elements, interactive components, and documentation of community workshops I'd conducted with populations typically excluded from traditional art spaces. The series explored themes of voice and silence, containment and expansion, heritage and innovation, artistic processing of both personal and cultural patterns of suppression and expression. Helena studied the central piece, a 7-foot spiral form with embedded lighting elements that created constantly shifting shadows as viewers moved around it. This is remarkable, Olivia. The integration of your father's architectural influence with your distinctive ceramic vocabulary creates something genuinely innovative. Her observation highlighted another dimension of transformation in my creative practice: the conscious incorporation of my father's legacy rather than separation from it. Where Raymond had positioned my artistic path as rejection of family tradition, I had discovered deeper continuity between my father's architectural vision and my own three-dimensional exploration of space, form, and function. As Helena and I concluded our meeting, finalizing timeline details for the center's renovation, my phone signaled an incoming message, a reminder of my dinner commitment with Zach and Isabel. Their engagement announcement the previous month had been another welcome development in our evolving family landscape, though Raymond's response remained unclear as they had chosen to share the news with family members individually, rather than at a gathering he would naturally preside over. After Helena departed, I spent several hours in focused studio work, completing detailed elements for the exhibition pieces before preparing for the evening's celebration. The creative immersion provided natural integration of the day's emotional and intellectual processing, transforming abstract feelings and thoughts into tangible forms that both expressed and clarified internal experience. The restaurant Zach had selected reflected his thoughtful consideration. Neither the formal, status-conscious establishments Raymond preferred, nor overly casual spaces that might undermine the evening's significance. The contemporary American bistro occupied renovated industrial space not unlike my studio building, its exposed brick walls and repurposed architectural elements creating an environment that honored heritage while embracing innovation. Zach and Isabel had already arrived when I entered, their genuine warmth in greeting me reflecting the deepened connection we had developed since grandmother's intervention. Where previous family interactions had been mediated through Raymond's hierarchical structure, our relationship now existed on its own terms. Authentic exchange between adults with mutual respect and genuine interest. We ordered the special appetizers already, Isabel explained as I joined them. The chef's doing this amazing local mushroom thing tonight that Zach's been obsessing about since he read the online menu. This small detail, Isabel comfortably making decisions. Zach, untroubled by minor deviations from formal etiquette, highlighted another dimension of change within our family culture. Raymond's rigid adherence to propriety and protocol had gradually given way to more relaxed authenticity as his direct influence diminished. "Before we celebrate properly," Zach said after initial greetings and catching up, "there's something we wanted to discuss with you." His expression suggested significance beyond casual conversation. "We've been talking about the wedding," Isabel continued. "Specifically about family dynamics and how to structure the event in ways that support healthier patterns rather than reinforcing old ones." The thoughtful consideration, approaching even celebratory events with awareness of underlying relational dynamics, reflected how thoroughly grandmother's observations had permeated family consciousness. "What are you thinking?" I asked, genuinely curious about their approach to this challenge. "We want to honor meaningful connections without defaulting to traditional family hierarchies," Zach explained, "which means reconsidering everything, from seating arrangements to ceremonial roles." Isabel nodded agreement. "We're particularly thoughtful about how to include your uncle without allowing his expectations to dominate the event's structure or energy. This deliberate planning, maintaining connection with Raymond while establishing boundaries around his influence, represented the balanced approach several family members had gradually developed following grandmother's intervention. "We'd like to ask you to create something for the ceremony," Isabel continued, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "Not just as Zach's cousin, but because your artistic vision captures exactly what we hope to express through this commitment." The invitation, recognition of my professional capacity rather than merely familial obligation, created familiar warmth of genuine validation. "I'd be honored," I replied simply. As our celebratory dinner continued, conversation flowing naturally between personal updates, wedding plans, and broader reflections, I found myself observing the quality of our interaction with newfound appreciation. The authentic exchange, free from performance anxiety or constant reference to Raymond's potential reactions, represented exactly the possibility grandmother had hoped to create through her intervention. family connection based on mutual respect, rather than hierarchical positioning. Have you heard anything from Uncle Ray about the foundation gala next month? Zach eventually asked, the question acknowledging the continued navigation of complex family dynamics despite significant positive evolution. The Eleanor Harrington Foundation's inaugural gala, celebrating both the official opening of the Arts Center and the first cohort of scholarship recipients, represented culmination of grandmother's vision and potential flashpoint for remaining family tensions. Patricia confirmed they've received the invitation, I replied. She indicated they're discussing attendance, which I interpret as Raymond struggling with competing desires to maintain his position as family patriarch while avoiding public acknowledgement of grandmother's choices. Zach nodded understanding. Classic Uncle Ray dilemma, weighing status considerations against pride considerations. The observation, offered without malice but with clear recognition of established patterns, highlighted another dimension of our evolving family culture: the capacity to acknowledge Raymond's behavior without either demonizing him or allowing his perspectives to dominate collective understanding. Whatever he decides, Isabel noted pragmatically, the center will open, the scholarships will be awarded, and the work will proceed. His presence or absence affects the emotional dynamics, but not the substantive impact of Eleanor's vision. This assessment, prioritizing meaningful outcomes over emotional reaction, reflected the grounded perspective Isabel consistently brought to family situations. Her relative distance from lifelong patterns, allowing clarity sometimes difficult for those embedded within them. As dinner concluded and we prepared to part, Zach embraced me with uncharacteristic emotional openness. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what, specifically?" I asked, echoing the question he had posed to me months earlier during our conversation after the will reading. "For maintaining your integrity, even when it was consistently challenged," he replied without hesitation. "You created possibility for all of us to recognize patterns we'd accepted without question. Grandma saw it first, but your example made her insights accessible in ways they might not have been otherwise." This acknowledgement, that my choices held meaning beyond personal fulfillment, added dimension to the validation grandmother's provisions had provided. Where her recognition had confirmed the legitimacy of my path, Zach's perspective suggested that path had significance for others navigating similar tensions between authentic purpose and external expectations. Driving home through the city's evening energy, I found myself reflecting on the multidimensional transformation that had unfolded since grandmother's intervention 6 months earlier. The external changes were readily apparent. The Arts Center development, my expanded creative practice, shifting family relationships, but the internal evolution was equally significant, though less visible. The most profound shift wasn't the material security provided by my inheritance, or even the professional opportunities that had emerged from it, but the gradual dismantling of internalized doubt constructed through years of systematic diminishment. Grandmother's explicit validation had created initial opening, but the ongoing integration had required conscious engagement with deeply embedded patterns of self-assessment. Arriving home, I found unexpected package waiting at my door, small, but carefully wrapped, the return address indicating it had come from Patricia, rather than including Raymond's name as family communications typically did. Opening it revealed a delicate ceramic piece I immediately recognized as one that had occupied Grandmother Eleanor's desk for decades. A small vessel form in characteristic blue glaze created by my father during his college years before he committed fully to architectural studies. The accompanying note reflected Patricia's characteristic consideration, but with newfound directness. "Found this while organizing Eleanor's personal items. She always said it should come to you eventually. It seems like the right time now, rather than waiting for Ray to make decisions about appropriate distribution. Your father was truly gifted. I see that same gift in your work." The small gesture, both the return of my father's early artwork and Patricia's willingness to act independently in facilitating it, represented another thread in the complex. rewiring of family relationships following grandmother's intervention. The changes weren't dramatic confrontations or complete restructuring, but rather incremental shifts toward greater authenticity and respect for individual perspective. The following weeks brought increasing momentum as the Arts Center renovation progressed and my exhibition opening approached. James and Sophie visited during their transition preparations. Their decision to relocate to Vermont for his new position with the environmental law firm representing perhaps the most concrete response to grandmother's challenge to examine whether our choices reflected authentic values or externally imposed expectations. It feels terrifying and exactly right simultaneously, James acknowledged, as we toured the nearly completed exhibition installation at Meridian Gallery. Leaving the prescribed path, the firm partnership track, the neighbors and connections, and status markers that have defined our lives for the past decade. Worth it? I asked, genuinely curious about his experience of this significant life reconfiguration. Absolutely, Sophie answered before he could, her expression reflecting combination of pride and relief. I've got my actual husband back, not the exhausted, disconnected corporate attorney who was gradually disappearing into Raymond's vision of success. James nodded agreement, his arm around his wife suggesting reconnection beyond the merely verbal. I keep thinking about what might have happened if Grandma hadn't intervened the way she did, if we'd just continued along established tracks without ever really examining whether they led toward places we genuinely wanted to go. The observation highlighted grandmother's particular gift, not merely the material provisions of her estate, but the intentional disruption of patterns that had constrained authentic choice and connection for decades. The night before my exhibition opening, I received unexpected message from Raymond, the first direct communication since his dramatic exit from our family meeting months earlier. The text was characteristically brief. Will attend your opening. Tomorrow with Patricia. Professional courtesy only. Does not indicate acceptance of current arrangements. The message's formal tone and explicit limitation of meaning reflected Raymond's ongoing struggle with the transformed family landscape, wanting to maintain connection and position while reserving continued objection to the changes grandmother's intervention had catalyzed. My response reflected my own evolution over the preceding months. You're both welcome. The exhibition stands on its own merits regardless of family dynamics. I appreciate professional courtesy and extend the same. This exchange, neither confrontational nor accommodating, simply clear and boundaried, represented my developing capacity to engage Raymond's energy without either defensive reaction or automatic deference to his implied authority. The exhibition opening exceeded all expectations, both professionally and personally. The gallery hummed with genuine engagement as visitors explored the installation pieces, the interactive elements creating unexpected connections among strangers, as they collectively influenced the light patterns and acoustic elements embedded in the sculptures. Art critics from 3 major publications attended, their preliminary comments suggesting recognition of both technical innovation and conceptual depth in the work. Gallery director Meredith Chen confirmed that several museum curators had expressed interest in potential acquisition or future exhibition opportunities. The professional validation was deeply satisfying, but equally meaningful was the presence of family members engaging with my work with newfound openness. Miranda and Ethan brought their children, who delighted in the interactive elements with uninhibited enthusiasm. James and Sophie arrived with genuine interest, their questions reflecting desire to understand, rather than merely perform appropriate support. Zach and Isabel naturally integrated with my community of artist friends, their authentic engagement bridging previously separate dimensions of my life. Raymond and Patricia arrived exactly at the announced starting time, not early to suggest special consideration, not late to suggest dismissiveness. Patricia immediately approached with warm embrace and genuine congratulations. Raymond maintained greater distance, his initial circuit of the exhibition space suggesting professional assessment rather than personal connection. I allowed him space for this approach, recognizing that engagement with my work represented significant step, given his consistent dismissal of its legitimacy throughout our previous relationship. Meredith's introduction of critic from prominent art journal provided natural opportunity for him to observe external validation of my professional standing, context that might allow him to adjust his perception without direct confrontation of previous assessments. Midway through the evening, Raymond approached as I was briefly alone between conversations, his expression suggesting internal conflict beneath carefully maintained composure. "The spatial integration is quite remarkable," he offered, gesturing toward the central installation piece. The 7-foot spiral form that had evolved significantly since Helena Foster's earlier visit to my studio. The engineering required for the cantilevered elements while maintaining structural integrity shows genuine technical sophistication. The observation, focusing on structural and technical elements rather than conceptual or aesthetic dimensions, reflected Raymond's particular perspective and vocabulary. Yet it also represented genuine attempt to engage the work on its own terms rather than dismiss it through familiar characterizations. "Thank you," I replied simply, neither elaborating to seek further approval nor diminishing the observation through false modesty. We stood in momentary silence, the gallery's energy flowing around us as visitors engaged with the exhibition pieces and each other. Raymond seemed on the verge of further comment when his attention shifted toward the gallery entrance, his expression registering surprise bordering on shock. Following his gaze, I discovered the source of his reaction. Dr. Helena Foster had just arrived, accompanied by distinguished older man. I recognized immediately from photographs as Richard Harrington, Raymond's estranged younger brother who had left the family business decades earlier following significant conflict with Raymond over its direction and values. Their presence together wasn't coincidental. In the month since beginning work with the foundation, I had gradually learned the full history behind its establishment. How Richard, after building successful independent career in sustainable development, had anonymously provided the initial funding for Eleanor's foundation as way to maintain connection with family values while avoiding direct conflict with Raymond's controlling approach. Richard's attendance at the exhibition opening, his first public appearance at family-adjacent event in nearly 20 years, represented another dimension of grandmother's restoration work extending beyond her death, creating conditions for healing family fractures that predated even my father's passing. Raymond remained frozen momentarily before visibly composing himself, decades of practiced social performance allowing him to mask the emotional impact of this unexpected development. Patricia moved immediately to his side, her hand on his arm suggesting both support and subtle restraint. The potential confrontation, Raymond face-to-face with the brother whose departure from family business he had characterized as betrayal and weakness for years, created momentary tension within the otherwise celebratory atmosphere. Yet something unexpected unfolded instead of the drama that might have been anticipated. Richard approached with Helena, his expression suggesting neither confrontation nor apprehension, but simply openness to the present moment. "Congratulations on remarkable exhibition, Olivia," he offered, his genuine warmth immediately apparent despite our limited previous contact. "Your grandmother would be immensely proud of how you've integrated technical precision with conceptual depth. Much like your father did in his architectural work." This reference to my father, acknowledging the creative lineage Raymond had consistently minimized, might have triggered defensive reaction under previous circumstances. Instead, Raymond surprised me with momentary authenticity breaking through, his careful composure. "Thomas always did have distinctive spatial vision," he acknowledged quietly. "These pieces reflect similar quality." The simple observation, offered without qualification or comparative diminishment, represented perhaps the most genuine recognition Raymond had ever expressed regarding either my father's gifts or my own creative capacities. Whether motivated by Richard's presence, the exhibition's undeniable professional success, or gradual internal reconsideration remained unclear, and ultimately mattered less than the acknowledgement itself. As the evening progressed, I observed Raymond and Richard gradually navigating toward brief, controlled interaction. Not dramatic reconciliation, but tentative acknowledgement of shared history and connection beyond decades of estrangement. Patricia's subtle facilitation and Helena's strategic positioning created context for this cautious re-engagement without demands for immediate resolution of long-established conflicts. The entire evening, professional success, family presence, unexpected reconnections, reflected the multidimensional transformation catalyzed by grandmother's intervention. What had begun as shocking disruption of established patterns had gradually evolved into opening for new possibilities across multiple domains, from creative expression to family relationships to community engagement. In the quiet aftermath following the exhibition opening, as I sat alone in my studio surrounded by preliminary sketches for new work emerging from the completion of the current series, I found myself returning to passage from grandmother's journal that had particularly resonated during recent months. Genuine legacy isn't constructed through accumulation or control, but through creating conditions that allow others to access their authentic capacities and contributions. The question isn't what we leave behind materially, but what patterns we establish that either constrain or liberate those who follow us. This understanding, that meaningful impact comes through creating possibility rather than directing outcomes, had guided grandmother's approach to her final arrangements. Rather than simply redistributing material resources, she had intentionally disrupted patterns that constrained authentic expression and connection, creating opening for new possibilities, without prescribing specific forms they might take. The resulting transformations had unfolded not as dramatic revolution, but as gradual evolution, family members making individual choices that collectively shifted the system's dynamics, relationships reconfiguring through series of small adjustments, rather than sudden rupture, new patterns emerging through consistent reinforcement rather than imposed structure. Raymond's brief moment of genuine acknowledgement at the exhibition opening didn't represent complete transformation of his perspective or approach. He would likely continue pursuing certain aspects of his legal challenges despite limited prospects for success. Family gatherings would still navigate complex dynamics and established patterns. Complete resolution of decades-long conflicts remained unlikely in the immediate future. Yet, something fundamental had undeniably shifted. Perspectives, previously suppressed, now found regular expression. Choices previously constrained by fear of disapproval now emerged with greater freedom. Connections previously mediated through hierarchy now developed through direct engagement. The family system as a whole demonstrated increased capacity for authenticity, disagreement without rejection, and recognition of diverse forms of contribution. As I began preparing preliminary sketches for new body of work, series exploring themes of transformation, resilience, and emergent structures, I recognized that grandmother's intervention had offered masterclass an effective catalyst role, identifying leverage points within established systems, creating strategic disruption that enabled new possibilities, providing resources and validation that supported emerging alternatives, maintaining focus on pattern transformation, rather than personality blame. This approach, addressing systems rather than merely symptoms, patterns rather than just people, offered powerful template for meaningful change in contexts far beyond our specific family situation. The principles applied equally to community, development, organizational transformation, cultural evolution, and artistic practice itself. The Art Center's upcoming opening represented perfect embodiment of these principles, transforming private property into community resource, historical legacy into contemporary engagement, individual achievement into collective possibility. The scholarship program would extend these transformations further, creating opportunity for emerging artists to develop their unique voices rather than conforming to established expectations or market demands. My phone chimed with incoming message, final confirmation from Meredith Chen, that 3 pieces from the exhibition had been acquired by the Contemporary Art Museum for their permanent collection. institutional validation that would significantly impact both the financial viability and critical reception of my ongoing practice. The news wasn't merely personal victory, but vindication of grandmother's assessment that work developed through authentic commitment to creative purpose, rather than market calculation or status consideration, ultimately generated both meaningful contribution and sustainable livelihood. The recognition emerged not through pursuit of external validation, but as natural extension of genuine artistic investigation and disciplined practice. As spring deepened toward summer outside my studio windows, new growth visible in both the community gardens and the neighborhood's ongoing development, I recognized parallel process unfolding across multiple dimensions of my experience. Internal, confidence expanding through consistent reinforcement; creative capacity, developing through dedicated practice; professional opportunities emerging through authentic engagement; family relationships evolving through honest interaction. None of these developments had occurred through dramatic single events, but through gradual accumulation of small choices, consistent actions, and sustained attention to underlying patterns rather than surface symptoms. The transformation, grandmother, had catalyzed wasn't revolutionary rupture, but evolutionary emergence. New possibilities developing from existing foundations, reconfigured according to more balanced and authentic principles. The realization offered perspective that transcended specific circumstances of my family situation or professional development. Meaningful change, whether personal, relational, creative, or cultural, rarely arrived through dramatic declarations or single interventions. Rather, it emerged through consistent realignment of daily choices and interactions, gradually establishing new patterns that enabled different possibilities to develop and flourish. This understanding didn't diminish the significance of grandmother's dramatic intervention through her will provisions. The disruption had been necessary catalyst, creating opening that might not have emerged through more gradual approaches. But the lasting transformation depended on how individuals responded to that opening, whether we collectively chose to develop its possibilities or revert to established patterns once the initial disruption subsided. The growing evidence suggested genuine evolution rather than temporary adjustment. James reclaiming his authentic professional path, Miranda creating space for her children's creative interests alongside academic achievement, Zach and Isabel designing wedding that honored meaningful connection rather than status performance, even Raymond demonstrating moments of genuine engagement, despite continued resistance to structural changes. These developments reflected grandmother's deeper wisdom, understanding that family healing required not just material redistribution, but reconstruction of the underlying narratives and patterns that had constrained authentic connection and contribution. Her approach had addressed both tangible resources and intangible dynamics, creating comprehensive foundation for potential transformation. The exhibition's success, art center development, and evolving family relationships weren't separate outcomes, but interconnected dimensions of this integrated approach: material support enabling expanded creative practice, public recognition validating contribution previously diminished, institutional development extending individual transformation into community impact. As I turned toward my work table, hands reaching for clay with familiar anticipation of discovery through creation, I recognized that grandmother's most significant gift hadn't been the financial inheritance or professional opportunities, but the fundamental permission to trust my own perceptions and follow my authentic path despite consistent external messaging, questioning its legitimacy. This gift, validation of internal authority rather than continued deference to external assessment, represented foundation for meaningful development across all domains. Creative practice flourished when grounded in genuine artistic investigation rather than market calculation. Relationships deepened when based on authentic exchange rather than strategic positioning. Community engagement generated impact when emerging from meaningful contribution rather than status consideration. The transformation grandmother had catalyzed continued unfolding across these domains, not as completed achievement, but as ongoing process of discovery, integration, and expression. Each small choice to maintain authentic perspective rather than defaulting to external validation, each moment of genuine connection rather than strategic interaction, each creative risk emerging from artistic purpose rather than safety calculation, all contributed to gradual establishment of new patterns that enabled different possibilities to emerge. As summer approached with its particular energy of growth and manifestation, I prepared for the Arts Center opening with confidence grounded in this understanding. Whatever specific form the event might take, whatever particular dynamics might emerge through Raymond's attendance or absence, the underlying foundation had been established for meaningful continuation of the transformational process grandmother had initiated. The vessel form taking shape beneath my hands, complex structure with integrated elements supporting each other through balanced tension rather than rigid hierarchy, embodied this understanding in physical form. Stability achieved not through dominance and control, but through thoughtful integration of diverse elements, each contributing according to its particular qualities and capacities to create whole that transcended its individual components. This emergent structure, in clay, in family relationships, in community development, reflected the essential wisdom underlying grandmother's intervention and the possibilities continuing to unfold from her courageous disruption of established patterns in service of more authentic connection and contribution. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.